for 35 days. Iran's supreme leader was missing as a physical fact. That is where this story begins. Not with the protests, not with the fuel lines, not with the medicine shortages, not even with the argument inside the IRGC. It begins with the top of the system going dark, because authoritarian systems do not rely only on force. They rely on embodiment. They need a visible apex, a face that makes every decree feel final, a body that turns hierarchy into reality, a voice that tells every institution below where authority lives. For 35 days, according to this source, Iran did not have that. No image with command, no public speech with weight, no visible sovereign center during the worst succession shock the Islamic Republic has faced in decades. That is not a detail, that is the crisis. The real story is not simply that Iran has protests and shortages and elite infighting. The real story is that all of those things are happening under an invisible leader. And once the apex disappears, every lower pillar begins to move on its own timing. That is when systems start to come apart. The source text makes clear that Mojtaba Khamenei still exists as the formal answer to the question of rule. But formal answers stop mattering when the operational answer is somewhere else. And the operational answer here appears to be a three-man committee of IRGC origin. Vahedi, Zolgadar, Mohsen Rezai, men of war, security, intelligence, and coercive statecraft. Men not chosen to embody clerical continuity, but now filling the practical space created by the disappearance of the man who was supposed to embody it. That distinction is everything, because once the formal ruler becomes invisible and a military security corps starts functioning as the real governor, the regime enters a different phase. It is no longer simply an embattled theocracy. It becomes a dark throne system. The symbols of authority remain at the top. But the actual chain of command is now being improvised underneath a vacancy that nobody can publicly name. That is very dangerous, not just because power is shifting, but because power is shifting without a publicly acknowledged transfer. The old shell is still there. The title remains, the statements continue. The courts, media, ministries, and rituals continue. But the visible center that used to synchronize all of them has gone dark. And once that happens, every fracture below the apex starts widening at once. The first fracture is between the absent top and the civilian state. Pezeshkian may be president, but this source leaves little doubt that the presidency is no longer governing in any meaningful central sense. It is constrained, overridden, publicly contradicted, reduced to form without sovereign substance. That matters because in normal regimes, even hard regimes, a president can still function as a political shock absorber. He can explain, negotiate, soften, delay, absorb blame, but an overridden president under a dark throne stops being a shock absorber. He becomes evidence of vacancy. He is still there, but everyone can see he is not the center. The second fracture is between the absent top and the clergy. This one is even more profound because it cuts into the regime's founding doctrine. The Islamic Republic did not present itself merely as a strong state. It presented itself as a rightful state. Rule by the supreme jurist, clerical authority fused to sovereignty, religious legitimacy, not just blessing power, but constituting power. Now imagine what that doctrine looks like when the supreme jurist is absent, the visible command shifts to a security committee, and the clerical establishment can do nothing but watch. That is why the source treats the current moment as the visible militarization of a system that once insisted its deepest legitimacy was religious. If the state can function under a guard, managed vacuum, then the clergy is forced to confront the most dangerous question in the entire architecture: was the Islamic center ever truly the center? Once that question is asked seriously, the old theological justification begins to disintegrate from within. The third fracture is between the absent top and the regime's social base. This is the layer most outsiders will misread because they will still treat it as an economic story. And of course, economics matters here. The blackouts are long, the fuel queues are humiliating, food costs are rising, medicine is scarce, hospitals are suspending treatment, businesses are dying, ATMs are emptying, the so called resistance economy has turned out to be a slogan patched together through tax hikes and inflationary financing that quietly strips wealth from ordinary families. But this becomes politically explosive not simply because life is hard. It becomes explosive because the top is absent while life is hard. That matters because authoritarian systems often survive pain by narrating pain. They convert sacrifice into meaning. They tell the public that, yes, this is difficult, but it serves a larger cause. You are not just suffering. You are enduring for the nation, for dignity, for independence, for the future, for history. That kind of narrative requires a visible center. It requires someone who can still embody the promise. Iran does not appear to have that right now. So the pain is no longer morally translated. It is simply pain. That is why the source is right to treat the Shah chants as existential. Those chants are not only anti-government, they are anti-myth. The Islamic Republic exists because the monarchy was overthrown and buried as the anti-future. If people in the streets now openly invoke the Shah, they are not merely demanding reform. They are reversing the regime's sacred story of history itself. That is what happens when the top goes dark. The old story loses its narrator. And then there is Hormuz. This is where the source text gets very sharp. The reopening of the strait did not just weaken Iran's bargaining position. It shattered the regime's psychological compact because it happened without visible return and without visible command. The Republic's whole self-image was built on one claim above all others. We do not bow, not after sanctions, not after war, not after pressure, not after isolation. Resistance is our identity. Then the strait was reopened without a clear public gain. That is the kind of concession that might still have been politically survivable under a visible, forceful apex. A leader at the top could have imposed a narrative. He could have said this retreat is discipline, not weakness, patience, not surrender. One step back for a larger strategic reason. He could have forced all the lower factions to align around a single explanation. But the throne was dark, so no coherent explanation held. The guards saw leverage surrendered, hardliners saw humiliation, the public saw sacrifice emptied of meaning. The clergy saw the regime lose dignity without spiritual authority present to sanctify the move. That is why the Hormuz moment detonated the vacuum rather than being contained by it. And once that happened, the fourth fracture opened inside the guard itself. The source says senior IRGC figures are now privately circulating the demand that Mojorabo should resign. That is extraordinary, not because regimes never face elite dissatisfaction, but because of who is dissatisfied. The guard was not supposed to challenge the supreme leader. It was supposed to guarantee the supreme leader. The minute the Praetorian institution begins privately discussing whether the apex itself should be removed, the regime has entered the zone where coercive power starts planning around the throne rather than beneath it. That is one of the most dangerous signs any authoritarian system can send, because once the men with the guns begin thinking in post-throne terms, the throne still exists physically, but politically it has already dimmed. This is worsened by the paranoia described in the source. Late March targeting operations hit figures who believed themselves safe. Internal communications are tightening. Questions of infiltration are spreading. Distrust grows inside the very institution. Now improvising rule, that is a bad combination. A dark throne above and a suspicious coercive core below. It means the one structure now trying to hold the system together is itself losing internal confidence. And that is why I think the deepest theme here is not protest, not economics, not even succession alone. It is desynchronization. A functioning revolutionary state does not require every layer to be happy, but it does require every layer to move in the same historical direction. The leader, the ideology, the coercive apparatus, the clergy, the social base, they all need to believe, however unevenly, that the system still has a center and still knows why it exists. Iran now appears to be losing that simultaneity. The leader is absent, the presidency is hollowed, the clergy is displaced, the guard is governing by default and doubting upward. The public is furious, the economy is failing, the founding story is being mocked by reality, That is not a normal crisis. That is a state losing synchronization across all the layers that once made it coherent. And once synchronization breaks, every new event becomes more dangerous. A protest wave lands on top of leadership vacancy. A power shortage lands on top of narrative collapse. A targeted strike lands on top of internal paranoia. A public concession lands on top of clerical hollowing. No single center processes the shock and converts it into order. The system starts arguing with itself while still trying to look whole. That is how regimes reach the threshold where they remain standing in form but have already begun to fail in substance. So is Iran finished? No one can say that with certainty. But that is not really the most important question in this source. The more important question is whether the Republic still has a visible enough apex, a coherent enough command, and a believable enough narrative to keep every lower pillar moving in the same direction, right? Now, the answer looks worse than it has at any point in years. That is why the missing images matter so much. That is why the Dark Throne matters. That is why the Guard Whispers matter. That is why the Shah chants matter. That is why Hormuz mattered so much. They are all signs of the same deeper fact. The state no longer looks fully convinced by its own center. And when a revolutionary regime stops being convinced by its own center, the question is no longer whether people are angry. The question becomes whether anyone still believes enough in the apex to keep sacrificing for it. That is how I would leave it. A system like this does not first die when the street gets loud. It begins to die when the throne goes dark and everyone underneath starts preparing for the world after it.